The fact is that the Bible is literarily diverse, but systematicians express the Bible's teaching almost exclusively in propositions. In effect, systematicians have to squeeze all the various types of literature they encounter in the Bible into one specific kind of expression. And this disparity is one of the greatest challenges facing systematic theologians. A second challenge that Scripture presents to systematic theologians is the way it arranges or doesn't arrange its doctrines. In a word, the Scriptures do not deal with particular themes in complete, discrete units. Instead, the same topic is often addressed in bits and pieces, scattered here and there throughout the Bible. And this characteristic of Scripture also challenges systematic theologians. Imagine that the Bible were different in this regard. Suppose that it dealt completely with one doctrine at a time. Suppose the Bible regularly dealt with one theme, thoroughly discussed it, and then moved on to the next theme. If this were so, then perhaps systematic theologians could simply read each portion of the Bible and easily form theological claims based on each part of the Bible. But of course, this is not how the Bible presents its theological themes. Or imagine that systematic theologians were less orderly, touching on one small aspect of a subject at a time. And suppose they commonly addressed many other bits and pieces of other doctrines before returning to address a second small aspect of the first doctrine. If they were satisfied to address a matter here and there in bits and pieces, then perhaps it would be relatively easy for them to work with Scripture. But of course, this is not what systematicians want to do. They want to present the teachings of Scripture as fully and as orderly as they can. And as a result, they have to work hard to combine information from all kinds of places in the Scriptures. The Scriptures touch on aspects of theological topics in various ways in different places. And this feature of the Bible's presentation of theology is another great challenge for systematic theologians. Now that we've seen two of the main challenges systematicians face as they work with Scripture, we should turn our attention to the process of factual reduction. This is the strategy systematicians use to overcome the challenge of literary variety in the Bible. In simple terms, factual reduction is the process of focusing on theological facts that biblical passages teach and marginalizing other dimensions of these same passages. As with human language in general, passages in the Bible were designed to have manifold impacts on their readers. They informed, inspired, accused, motivated, directed, encouraged, discouraged, delighted, perplexed, corrected, trained, facilitated, blessed, cursed, stirred the imagination, and so on and so on. Now, not all passages in the Bible were designed to do all of these things all of the time, and certainly not with equal force. But every biblical passage of significant length was designed to have a variety of impacts. But systematic theologians focus their attention primarily, if not exclusively, on the theological facts taught in Scripture. In other words, systematicians reduce their attention to factual considerations, while other features of biblical texts go largely unattended. Now, the process of reducing Scripture to its facts is relatively straightforward when biblical passages were designed primarily to assert factual claims. In these situations, systematicians simply note the explicit and implicit facts presented in a biblical text, and then focus on those facts that are pertinent to their discussions. Take 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 as an example of a passage that focuses on facts. There Paul said, "All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness." Now, in the larger context, we can tell that this verse was designed to be much more than a mere catalog of facts about the Bible. Paul connected this verse to the preceding context as a motivation for Timothy to pay careful attention to the Scriptures. At the very least, this verse was designed to encourage and to motivate Timothy to renew his commitments to the Scriptures. But a prominent dimension of this complex design was to make a number of explicit theological assertions. And systematic theologians make much use of this passage because they're interested in these factual theological claims. The explicit facts of this passage can be summarized in a series of universal and affirmative propositions. All Scripture is God-breathed. All Scripture is useful for teaching. All Scripture is useful for rebuking. All Scripture is useful for correcting. All Scripture is useful for training. These propositions reflect the factual considerations communicated explicitly by this verse. In addition to these explicit claims, this verse logically entails a number of implicit claims that are also of interest to systematicians. For instance, it's fair to say that God desired to communicate His will. This passage also implies that attention to Scripture is vital to sanctification. And even though Paul spoke specifically of the Scriptures of the Old Testament, he implied that the New Testament Scriptures are also inspired and useful in these ways.